Please.
Thank you so much. Wow, you guys really packed it in here. We are eternally grateful for that. So hi, welcome to the Same Name, Different Game panel. This is a panel about a history of ports and versions of different video games. And Norm, the Gaming Historians panel, got rescheduled, which made us eternally grateful because we were up against him on the original schedule.
And most of us want to go see it.
And most of us want to go see it. So, who are these people sitting at this table in front of you? My name is Joe Drilling. I host a show on YouTube called Same Name, Different Game, hence the name of this panel. It is about ports and versions of different video games. And to my right,
my name is Gunstar, or Adam, and I host a show that's all Sega stuff. There's a couple different ones that's about imports, different comparisons, histories, or perspectives, all kinds of stuff. If it's Sega, it goes on the channel.
and to his right.
My name is Eric. I run a channel called Game vs. Game is the primary show on there. I also do a smaller series called History Bites, which is specific events in gaming history. And I've been working on a few other new things, but primarily Game vs. Game, focusing on different ports and versions, things like that.
And to his immediate right.
Hi, my name is Dan. I also do a YouTube series called Console Wars, where I compare Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis games with my friend and do little comedy skits. And we're silly.
Yeah, very silly, but also educational. So let's get started. So what is a port, right? So we're going to talk about the difference between a port, a version, and a remake. A port is usually during the time that the game comes out, it is an attempt to replicate the original version of the game as closely as possible. I think what most people think of as arcade games, right? So a game comes out in the arcade, and it's an attempt to replicate that on a home system with, the closest possible, exactness as you can get. But they're usually not. They usually fall short. A version is where the game shares the same title, but it's a different experience completely, right? So the example here that you see is Strider on the arcade, and then you have Strider on the NES. Those games were actually developed at the same time, and they are vastly different experiences if you're familiar with them at all. Strider in the arcade is a pretty straightforward action game where you just go from, through stages linearly until you meet the final boss and finish the game. The NES version is sort of kind of a Metroidvania-ish thing, which is a lot different. So that's a version as opposed to a straight up. And a remake is a remake. So it's not an attempt at parody. It's not an attempt to make this thing exactly as it was before. It's a new interpretation of usually the same story or similar stuff. So the example here is DuckTales. We had DuckTales on the NES, and then we had DuckTales Remastered several years later. And DuckTales Remastered is very clearly inspired by the original NES game, but it is a vastly different experience. It's similar to when a film is remade. It's not the same. It's not an attempt to, unless it's Gus Van Sant's Psycho, which we all agree was a terrible idea. It's an attempt at doing something different with the same sort of story. So why is this stuff important? It's important that, so first of all, it's interesting, right? It's just interesting from a historical perspective because we don't see this really anymore. If you look at, the Xbox 360 version of Batman Arkham Asylum and the PlayStation 3 version of Batman Arkham Asylum, unless you have an extremely trained eye, you're not going to be able to tell the difference, right? So we're gonna do a little experiment here. I want everybody to think of Double Dragon. Okay, everybody in this room, think of Double Dragon, what that means to you. Okay, do we all have an image for Double Dragon? Yep. Okay, which of these things were you actually thinking about? Because all of these things are Double Dragon, right? So, maybe you were thinking of, right? Maybe you were thinking of the terrible cartoon or the really bad movie with Scott Wood. But my bet is that most people were probably thinking of the image in the middle, which is the NES Double Dragon. But the original Double Dragon is actually the one on the left, which is the arcade version, and then there's the Master System port, The one at the bottom is the Atari 2600 version.
Which don't leave in ports out.
And there's like 20 more versions. There's literally, I think, 20-ish versions of Double Dragon. So from a game preservation standpoint, you start to run into, which, if any of these, is worth preserving. I mean, I would say they're all worth preserving. But, that becomes a thing. So when you say Double Dragon, you're not just talking about this arcade game or this NES game that everybody knows. You're talking about several other titles.
And of course, the other thing too with the importance is from at least that era from that earlier time, it kind of fueled a lot of even advertisements. I mean, Sega versus Nintendo, a lot of people would argue, getting the different versions, which ones are significant, but people would use the different ports and the different versions to argue my console's better, your console's better. So it kind of helped escalate that console war era when it was there.
Yeah, and so actually, I sort of want to ask everybody on the panel. Because for me, it was just a fascination with this stuff, and that it's not around anymore, that led me to start making same name, different game. And what, for you guys, what sort of inspired you to explore this in a way that,
For me, it was mainly that there was such a little focus on a lot of the more outlier Sega stuff. Like people always talk about Sonic, and they always talk about a few other bigger Sega franchises. Basically it's almost always Sonic. And there's all these great hidden gems that never came out of Japan. There's all these, little interesting tidbits, the history, the insane differentiation between America and Japan, all the arguments of that 90s era that sort of weren't being preserved at that point of these different versions and everything. There was just so much unearthed from Sega's perspective as opposed to Nintendo, which have been covered time and time again by a lot of people online already. So,
Eric?
For me, it was really when I really started getting into collecting, because I was always a collector, but a lot of it was just carried over from childhood, the games that I had. I never really added to it once I became an adult. And so I really wanted to, when I got into collecting, sort of curate my collection of, I wanted the sort of the best of the best. And so I was running into, I wanted to pick up Earthworm Jim, which ended up being my first episode. I wanted to get Earthworm Jim, but which version to get? And so I really started researching this stuff and was like, this is way more complex than I thought, and it's kind of interesting. And so I started working on videos.
Dan?
Yeah, I guess for me it was, because I had always known when I was a kid that the 16-bit games were always like different versions. And then I guess as an adult, and I had my own money, I was like, oh, let me go back and check out the different versions, because I grew up with Sega version of Aladdin, and I never played the Super Nintendo one, so I just wanted to see why is it different, or how different is it, so it just fascinated me, so I did my series.
Yeah. Okay, so when did all this start? And actually the answer to that question is the very beginning. So Computer Space was the first arcade video game. I couldn't find a good screenshot, but that's the awesome flyer with the fiberglass cabinet that was way too expensive to produce. It was the very first arcade video game. So there were electromechanical machines, there was pinball, there was stuff like that. But the actual first video game in an arcade was Computer Space. And it was essentially an unlicensed port of a game called Space War, which a lot of people will say is the first video game, period. That's not a debate I care to enter right this moment, because it's a big digression. But we'll just say, for the sake of argument, that that Computer Space was the first video game. It was programmed by a guy named Steve Russell at MIT. It was for mainframe computers, and it was basically it was like asteroids. It was a very primitive version of asteroids, except instead of shooting asteroids, you shoot each other, and that's what Computer Space was. So the first arcade video game was a port of something else. So we're going all the way back to this being a thing. And here's a little disclaimer. Do we have any English or European folks in the room? Any Brits? Any Euros? No? Okay, great. Perfect. So we don't know anything about British microcomputers, and that's a big scene where there's ZX Spectrum and the BBC Micro and the Acorn and the Amstrad and the C64. We know nothing about any of that stuff, so we're not going to be talking about it.
If you are interested in those versions, there's a great magazine called Retro Gamer that tends to be sold at Barnes & Noble. It's an import magazine. I've been reading it for the past few months. I learned a lot about that kind of stuff, but even if we had a big knowledge of it, it's such a vast category that you could take up an entire panel just talking about those. So.
Absolutely. And I would recommend a YouTuber named Kim Justice, who is English, and she does really great stuff talking about the British micros and stuff.
Guru Larry as well.
And Guru Larry
does a lot of that stuff too.
Yeah. So Yeah, so I said who is this guy, but actually that's Clive Sinclair, in case anybody's curious who that guy actually is. It's Clive Sinclair. And also, there's not, just because for time constraints, we didn't put in a lot of stuff about handhelds in this presentation either. We may touch on them, but like they're not going to be the focus. So we're going to start with arcades. How many people, show of hands, who remembers that place? Wow, you're all babies. Okay. So, that is in Aladdin's Castle, and you've all made me feel very old. That is in Aladdin's Castle. It was an arcade chain among many. There was a Time Out, it was owned by Sega. Aladdin's Castle eventually was owned by Namco. Capcom owned their own line of arcades called Nickel City at one point. Sega still owns, what do they call it? Somebody help me. No. GameWorks, yes, GameWorks.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of them were owned by companies that produced games. But that's an arcade, and you don't see those super frequently anymore.
You see arcades a lot now.
So the way we broke this presentation up, at Eric's excellent suggestion, is we're going by the types of ports, and then we'll go through eras one at a time. So we're starting with arcade ports, and we're going to start in the arcade ports portion with the Atari Age, also known as the second console generation. No, come in. The second console generation, which is the Atari Age. So these are just screenshots of three pretty important ones here. Space Invaders was a big deal. Atari signed an exclusive deal to put Space Invaders on 2600. And I don't know, I think it's a pretty faithful port of Space Invaders.
Yeah, I think it's, for the kind of game it is, that it wasn't kind of hard to replicate the system.
Yeah.
So.
What you're seeing in the arcade screenshot is actually, those aren't graphics, there's like a glass backdrop if you're unfamiliar with the Space Invaders cabinet. So the game is reflected on this sort of glass backdrop, painted glass backdrop with a crater and stuff. So that's not actual graphics, just the game itself is a black screen with the white aliens. So the Atari version's pretty good. Next to that...
a game that caused a, began the crash, essentially.
Began the American video game crash in 1983. That's Pac-Man. You can see right there the huge difference. On the top is Arcade Pac-Man, and on the bottom is Atari 2600 Pac-Man. And if you've never played Atari 2600 Pac-Man, don't waste your time.
Well, I always argue from a historical perspective, it's kind of interesting to see the differences, but it was as bad as they said it was back then.
Which is worse, Pac-Man or E3? E.T.?
Right, so both of those games at the same time. They made more Pac-Mans than there were Atari 2600s on the market. Because Pac-Man was such a big arcade hit, they were sure that it was going to... Everybody who owned an Atari console would buy one, and then people would buy more Atari consoles to have Pac-Man. And that did not happen.
And then they tried to do it again with E.T., and it still didn't work again.
And that was
the last one.
That was that, yeah. And then all the way on the right is Donkey Kong, and what you're seeing in the top is the arcade version of Donkey Kong, and on the bottom is actually the ColecoVision version of Donkey Kong, which was a big coup for Coleco. They had a timed exclusivity, is what we would refer to it as now, on Donkey Kong. Is anybody familiar? With the ColecoVision version? That's just a screenshot. I actually played it.
Yeah, I played it a couple of times. It's like I said, for that generation of console, like it looks pretty faithful, it plays pretty faithfully. Like it does have like a noticeable like it runs a little worse than the arcade version. It looks a little worse, but like
Donkey Kong's on the wrong side.
But like like for the era like that it came out in, I was like impressed having gone back and played it.
So I don't know. The Atari Age is weird because there were a ton of arcade ports and most of them didn't stand up. Maybe you guys agree? Is there any? Space Invaders is really the only one I can think of.
Yeah, like it was at a point where like there was such a big disparity between what you could run on an arcade board and what you could run on these home consoles. So at the time, it was really hard to port them over very faithfully. And you know, sometimes you get something that's like pretty good. It wasn't like for a home console you were happy to have it. But most of the time you'd end up with a Pac-Man. Basically, is that it'd just be like near unplayable.
Ms. Pac-Man, for the record, on 2600 is much better. Okay, so third generation. Third generation is basically NES and Sega Master System. And this is going to be a lot more bread and butter, I think, for most people here. So we talked about Strider a little bit earlier. And again, that's a version. Those were developed at the same time, along with the manga. The NES version actually continues the storyline of the manga. The arcade version is totally separate, I think. What's the feeling on NES Strider among the panel members?
No. I'm never a big fan.
To be honest, I own it. I've never played it. So
Now you have a reason to.
Dan?
Yeah, I never played.
I like it. It's not as good as the arcade version, but I still do. In the middle is, actually the two rightmost are Capcom. And Capcom did a really good thing, I think, during the NES era, where, actually all these are Capcom games, did a really good thing during this generation where they realized pretty early on, like 1942 is a pretty direct port, Section Z is changed slightly, but they eventually sort of came to the realization that the NES just did not have the horsepower to duplicate arcade experiences, and so they were instead going to go pretty far afield and just do totally different stuff. So what you see on the right there is Bionic Commando. Arcade Bionic Commando and NES Bionic Commando are not even remotely the same thing. The only similarity is that you have a robot arm that you swing with. And that's pretty much where the similarities have been.
And arguably the NES version is better.
I don't even know that that's arguable. Anybody argue that? Anyone in the panel argue for the arcade version of Bionic Commando?
If anybody else played the arcade version of Bionic Commando, I'd be like,
That's on the Capcom Classics
That's
selections. Anybody? Nobody? Nobody's going to stand for the... Okay.
poor
All right.
game.
Ninja Gaiden. Man, let's talk about Ninja Gaiden.
That's interesting.
Ninja Gaiden has been moved to a lot of other systems, and none of the versions are the same, except for the NES version and the Super NES version, and the PC Engine version. Those three are the same. The rest are all different.
Yeah.
And the Master System version is actually really good, but it only came out in Europe.
Yeah. It is based on the Game Gear version, though, which
It's not actually.
Is it?
It's totally different than
Really?
the Game Gear version. Yes, which is weird because most. That's the thing that we should mention.
Yeah.
It's like, tell the people about that.
Yeah, so with in Europe, where the Master System was a much more popular console, a lot of the Game Gear games that we got in the US were actually released on PAL consoles and for the Master System there, which where a lot of people are more familiar with them. So, I mean, like, there's a lot of Master System ports of games from the NES that you never saw here that happened. Back to the Future Part 3 happened on that. That's actually it's based on neither the NES or the Genesis version. It's like its own game entirely there, too. That's in the versions. But, like, there was a Sonic the Hedgehog that was there, too. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other ports that I'm going to forget off the top of my head now when I'm a moment, but...
And a lot of Game Gear, because the hardware between the Game Gear and the Master System were so similar, a lot of them were ported to and from each other. So like Sonic 2 on the Master System and Sonic 2 on the Game Gear are pretty much identical, except the screen is cropped really badly on the Game Gear version, and it makes it almost unplayable.
Yeah, Battletoads the same way
Right.
on Master System.
And there's a lot of games like that. Okay, before we move, anybody down at that end of the table, anything to say about NES or Master System stuff before we move on to 16 bits?
Okay.
Okay. Well, that's good, Dan, because you're going to talk a lot, I think, during this section, because we're talking about the fourth generation now. Fourth generation, of course, most widely known for Super NES and Genesis. And this was also, there was a thing that happened at this time where the arcade got a big resurgence at this time. And that coincided with the rise of the 16-bit consoles and what we in America think of as a 16-bit war, where the Genesis, Sega actually was doing better than Nintendo for a brief time. And that was the only time that happened. And so you get a lot of fighting games that were arcade games that then get ported. So on the bottom there, I actually labeled them because they're so similar with Street Fighter 2. You've got arcade, Super NES, Genesis, and the PC Engine, which never actually came out in the American TurboGrafx version of Street Fighter 2. And then you've got Mortal Kombat, of course, which was a big thing. So, yeah, so Dan.
Yes, Joe.
You've talked about Mortal Kombat on your show.
Yeah.
Among other things. And NBA Jam, you just posted an episode on NBA Jam, which was also an arcade game that went to the...
that's all they do, right?
That's all they do, 16-bit stuff. So, I mean, talk about this a little bit. What do you notice as far as disparities between the Genesis, which system's more capable of bringing over the arcades?
Well, for Mortal Kombat, the most obvious thing is the blood, right? You have the blood code for Sega, and then Nintendo's wanted to be fairly family friendly, so they didn't have any blood, they didn't have blood code. That's one of the big differences. And fatalities, just totally taken away from the Super Nintendo version, kept in the Sega version, again, with the blood code. And that, as Joe mentioned, that fueled the console war and helped with that the Sega version sell a lot more than the Super Nintendo version. So that's Mortal Kombat.
So what happened with Mortal Kombat 2 then?
With Mortal Kombat 2, Nintendo learned their lesson, and they, of course, put blood in, and it fared much better that time.
So as far as like graphical fidelity, right? The Sega Genesis didn't have quite the graphical fidelity of the Super Nintendo, right?
Right, and the sound was a little, didn't have quite like all the voiceovers and everything that Super Nintendo did.
What about NBA Jam?
NBA Jam, that's an interesting one. They're pretty much the same game, but like there's one major difference, and then there's no music in the Super Nintendo version when you play. There's just no music at all, and it's the only version that doesn't have any music when you play, because it was also ported not only for Sega and Super Nintendo, but Game Boy and Game Gear. There's music when you play in those versions. There's none in Super Nintendo while you're actually playing, so it's just very odd, super weird.
So yeah, so a lot of it goes to the ability. Like if you look at the screenshots of Mortal Kombat there,
That's full.
it's yes, it's full. So if you look in the center at that's the. Now I have to look closer. The center is Super Nintendo, and the right is Genesis with Mortal Kombat. You can see the colors are a little more muted on the Genesis version. The background layer looks a little more backgroundy, for lack of a better term, on the Super Nintendo because of its wider color palette and the transparencies that it can do. But man, Street Fighter 2, I feel like, so Eric and I did a big like crossover 2-episode thing about Street Fighter about a year and a half ago, and I feel like Street Fighter really, like Capcom developed all of the versions that we're looking at here, not the PC version and stuff they didn't, but Capcom really did a great job with Street Fighter.
Yeah.
I feel like, and on all the systems. Some people slag off the Genesis version, but I think it's still a really solid port. I think they're all.
And that Genesis port had some influence later on too. The sale, like Capcom was not a big Sega player at the time, especially with Sega not doing very well in Japan. And the US version, like the US release of Street Fighter 2 sold so well and convinced Capcom to start doing more stuff on that system, which is why we got stuff like Wily Wars and the second Magical Quest for the Disney series, stuff like that. Also, just because it tends to get lost in the shuffle when people talk 16-bit, there are other ports of Street Fighter Mortal Kombat on other consoles, including what at the time was the only and like considered definitive version of Street Fighter 2 at its last release was on the 3DO of all things, which was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which was supposed to be like this fantastic port. And people said it didn't really get taught until like the collection started coming out in 5 or 6 years later, which had to do with the fact that surprisingly the 3DO did okay in Japan actually, so there was enough of a following there for them to take that version, which did come out in the US, but it's hard to find now, and now there's no reason to have it. But back then, as a 3DO person, you could be like, I got the real version of Street Fighter.
Yeah, I actually had a friend who had a 3DO in the day because he was spoiled, and yeah, it was a really amazing port.
And then also some people, I mean, there's a lot of argument about this one, but a lot of people will say that the Atari Jaguar version of Rayman is like one of the best. You can argue whether that's actually a 16-bit console or not, but they're those kind of consoles.
It's of that generation though, right?
Yeah, they do get lost in the shuffle, and there is some interesting conversions and stuff to look at on those that kind of get lost at some points. It's always great.
Adam's favorite version is actually the Tiger R-Zone version.
I could actually talk about Gamecom ports. That's actually its own.
No. Moving on.
They still look them as voices.
So we start looking at the fourth generation is important too because as you were saying about the 3DO version of Street Fighter 2 Turbo, or Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo I should say, we're getting really close to parity, right? So if you look on the left, those are arcade Ninja Turtles games, and if you look on the right, on the top, we have the NES port of the first Ninja Turtles arcade game, and on the bottom, we have the Super NES port of the second Ninja Turtles arcade game. And as you can see, the Super NES version, it still doesn't look perfect to what the arcade could do at the time, but it's really close. It's like the sprites are a little smaller and they don't have quite as many colors, but like you're getting very close.
Yeah, you lose some of the like samples and the music and stuff, but
And of course, the 4-player support.
And you use
Right.
4-player. But you gain 2 extra stages.
yeah.
Yep.
You gain Bebop and Rocksteady and pirate outfits, which like
Why not?
Yeah,
Combos are balanced.
right. Exactly.
Yeah,
So
versus mode.
and you get versus mode, and you get the shredder boss where you throw ninjas at the screen,
Yeah,
which is
that's
The
cool.
Technodrome.
Yeah, the Technodrome. Yeah, which is great. So I don't think I haven't done an episode on any of the Ninja Turtles. Oh, you guys did Hypersonic Heist, right?
Yeah.
And Turtles in Time. What do you think? You looked at Turtles. You did some Turtles research before this panel. So drop some Turtles knowledge on us.
What should I say about the Turtles? I mean, they're really good, these arcade ports. They're just ridiculously close to the original. And, I mean, even the Sega version, the Hyperstone Heist, it's not quite Turtles in Time, but you know, you can see that they're definitely influenced. Like, some of the stages kind of look the same. And it's the only one that has Tatsu from the movies, like a rated character. So it's, yeah, it's got some little gems in its own right, but I think Turtles in Time is definitely the more superior.
Yeah, I would be inclined to agree.
Hope you guys, I gotta get going.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we get closer to parity, and that's always been the quest, right? And so in the NES, we did have some stuff. Like HAL did a couple of ports of what at the time were really old arcade games. Like they did Defender 2 and Joust, 6-7 years after those games were in the arcade, and they looked really good on the NES. But for contemporaneous releases, the 4th generation is where we really start to see that coming through. And moving along to the 5th generation, the big disparity in the 5th generation, generally speaking, is going to be carts versus CDs. So the PS1 and the Saturn against the N64 and what that ends up looking like. So what we're looking at here is San Francisco Rush. And we've got the arcade version, which 3D hardware is getting better and better, but arcade hardware is so expensive that it's very difficult to accurately replicate that. So then, on the right, we have the N64 and the PS1 version stacked on top of each other. And it really varies from game to game which of those ends up being better. I mean, it's so hard to say with N64 versus PS1. I think that a lot of racing games are better on the N64, but there's a lot of the wrestling games, for example. Mortal Kombat Trilogy is better on the PS1.
I mean, the big difference is with N64, you're gonna lose the load times, so your games are gonna boot up quicker ones. You're not gonna necessarily run into like any kind of stagnation from disk reading. But on the other hand, you're gonna lose audio and graphical quality due to less space on the card when you would have on disk.
Eric, do you have opinions about N64 versus PS1?
To an extent, yes. 'Cause I just did an episode on, it's not Saturn, but it was N64 versus Dreamcast for episode 1 Racer. And I think that was more of just like a shortcoming in terms of the Dreamcast, taking the game. But like even between generations that way, like the cart itself holds up pretty well against the disc. And so I mean, it's not impossible for the cart to end up being preferable. I mean, we moved so quickly from carts to optical media that carts sort of like get tossed aside. I mean, we're all sitting here digging through bins of them to collect them, but you get my point that we moved away from it so quickly. But I still think carts ultimately still have something to bring to the table.
I mean, we're still using them on handheld systems. So
Yeah,
it's not like
exactly.
they've gone entirely out the window.
Absolutely. Okay, so we need to move this along. We want to get through this whole presentation. So, okay, the only thing I wanted to say specifically about the Saturn is that, like, you can't tell from these screenshots, but the 2D fighting games on the Saturn, especially, were just so much better than what the PlayStation was capable of. All the Versus, the Capcom Versus series games on the PlayStation, the tag feature is removed unless you both pick the same 2 characters. That's the only way the tag feature works, because the Saturn, or the PlayStation rather, just couldn't do that. And the Saturn ports of all those Capcom fighting games are very nearly arcade perfect.
What about the blue shadows?
No, stop. Right, Saturn had transparency problems, so the shadows weren't right. So, yeah. So that's it for arcades. After that, there's not really any noteworthy arcade ports. Once you get into the PS2 era, pretty much everything is exactly the same unless it's the steering wheel is needed or something like that. But graphically,
I have to chime in. The reasoning for that, just if anyone's curious, is the Saturn was built with 2D in mind, and they basically had to shove 3D capability into the Saturn to be the PS1. So the PS1 was built more with 3D in mind, so they were able to put out more 2D games that were more comparable to their encounter forces that the system was built for.
right. Although for the record, well, actually, we'll get to that one.
Sure.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about PC to console conversions. He's got it. So back in our day, we called them IBM compatibles. So Eric wanted to talk specifically about the Mac Ventures.
Yeah, because I can't get enough of these things. And I don't know what it is, but I love the fact that there was something specifically designed to use the mouse, to use the interface on a PC, mouse, keyboard, that sort of thing, and they brought it over to home consoles where you have a D-pad and buttons. And for whatever reason, I'm fascinated with it. It's one of the things in my collection that I'm specifically always looking for to add these point-and-click adventures that are now like drag and push adventures. But obviously Mac Venture is probably the most commonly known with Shadowgate, Deja Vu, Uninvited on the NES.
Because they're actually good, right?
Yeah,
the NES ports
really
of
good.
those
They're
games.
very, very playable. And like if ever you've played what was a point-and-click adventure, like maybe Blazing Dragons on the PS1 or something like that, like you might have been turned off just because like, oh, I gotta move the stupid D-pad around and click the button. The Mac Ventures are a great sort of like entry-level way to get into these point-and-click adventures on the home console because they've got a specifically built interface to support it. It was taking the source material and designing it around the experience on home console, and I just find that fascinating. Obviously, there's other ones.
There are more. So we've got
plenty.
We've got King's Quest. That's at the top. We've got the DOS version. On the bottom, we have the Sega Master System version of King's
Which
Quest.
is way too expensive.
Right. In the middle, we've got King's Quest V. At the top, that's the CD-ROM VGA version. And on the bottom is the NES version. You can see quite a disparity in graphical fidelity there. And on the right is Maniac Mansion. The top is the original DOS version, and the bottom is the NES version. I actually think, maybe it's just me and the people I know but I feel like Maniac Mansion really got traction as an NES game.
Yeah,
I thought so too.
And it's weird too because they didn't change the interface for that one when they did the Mac Venture.
Yeah.
People like
No, they really didn't.
They were just kind of like people just let it go because it's that good of a game. I'd have to assume.
Yeah.
Well, the first one was on the Commodore 64.
Yeah, it was DOS and Commodore was the initial release. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But they look essentially. That actually might be a screenshot from the Commodore. They look basically identical. It's not trained enough to be able to tell the difference. But yeah, Maniac Mansion I think is a good example of it done right. But the King's Quest, the 8-bit home console King's Quest games are garbage. I think. Konami actually released King's Quest V on the NES.
Yeah.
Which is really weird.
Even still, there are things that I like. I find myself compulsed to. I have to own these things. And I don't know why. I love point-and-click adventures, and now I apparently have to love them on home consoles.
There's one major PC to console port that we have to talk about because it really spawned an entire series of very well-known, very hyped, very good games. Any guesses? Anyone? Any guesses?
Missed? Nope.
Anyone?
Doom.
No.
I mean
It's
those
close. That
are
is a good one,
important,
though.
but they're not as important as.
Metal Gear. So Metal Gear was a Japanese PC game for the MSX computer standard, and it was ported to the NES without Kojima's input. And the NES port is actually really not nearly as good as the MSX version, but we never got the MSX version in North America, and really the NES version is what made the series popular enough that Konami would consider releasing Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation.
Snake's Revenge?
Snake's Revenge is a garbage fire. We're not talking about Snake's Revenge.
Wasn't somebody wearing an I Feel Asleep t-shirt that walked in?
I thought so.
Why do you think I was saying that?
Might be that guy who left.
Maybe.
Yeah, so I would highly recommend the MSX version of Metal Gear now is very easily available. It's on the if you get the Metal Gear Legacy collection for PS3 or
Metal Gear Solid 3.
Xbox 3, yeah, it was on Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence. It's really easily accessible. It's not very expensive, and it's so much better than the NES version. I highly recommend checking out the original version.
I think you get Metal
The
Gear
NES
2 with
version
it.
added the outside bits, right?
It
Yeah,
added the outside.
that jungle.
Well, there was a little bit of outside stuff, but yeah,
that jungle opening.
the entry point is totally different. And then we moved to the 4th generation. I'm sorry, what were you guys saying before? Doom. The console ports of Doom are not very good.
None of them. All like 12 of them.
It's not the best.
Yeah.
Maybe. None of them. They all have their own shortcomings. That if all of them were like plugged together into one, maybe a good version would come out of it.
The 32X port doesn't have any sound.
But if you want to get technical, make it quick. If the Jaguar version had music, Jaguar probably would have been the version.
Yeah,
But-
the 32X is actually a pretty. People like to make fun of the 32X port. I mean, the music does sound a little farty, but it's not a terrible port. And it was actually ported eventually to like the GBA and stuff. Like that game is everywhere. And then we have Wolfenstein as well, which obviously is like the precursor to Doom. Super Nintendo Wolfenstein is bad.
It's kind of important because that caused Super Noah's Ark to happen. But
It did, yes, it goes Super
Where's
Noah's Ark
it?
3D. Super 3D Noah's Ark. Super Noah's Ark 3D. Super 3D Super Noah's Ark. Dan, do you have any feelings on 16-bit ports of Doom or Wolfenstein 3D?
he likes them.
Oh, God.
I don't.
Doom 64 is good.
Although Doom on Super Nintendo is noteworthy because it's one of the few cartridges that is another color besides gray. Maximum Carnage, Doom, Killer Instinct,
That was good timing.
RoboCop versus Terminator. And so,
Oh, God. Mega Man DOS.
need I say more?
Batman Arkham Knight.
There was an actual.
Batman Arkham Knight, that's a modern one. Batman Arkham Knight.
It wasn't much better, but most people don't know there
Still
was
broken.
actually other like
Still
more
broken.
official ports of Mega Man to PC that happened later. There was I think it was Mega Man 3.
Don't ruin my joke. Stop ruining my joke.
We're here to inform. goddammit.
Language. There are children in the audience. Okay, so we're going to talk about console-to-console ports. So basically, that's where like we made it for this thing. Now we're going to make it work on this other thing, and I'm actually going to spin it over to Eric right away to talk about Earthworm Jim, his first episode.
Yeah, that was my very first episode. And I think this is probably one of the more fascinating elements of the whole versions and porting and that sort of thing. Just because, especially between the Genesis and Super Nintendo, they had such different architectures, different resolutions, different color palettes, and so there were attempts to just take exactly what I've made for the Genesis or Super Nintendo and shove it into the other game or the other system. And to varying degrees of success. Earthworm Jim is great because they actually went back. They developed it initially for the Genesis and went back to add different touches, basically tailor it to the Super Nintendo. And so they added more graphical flair. With the support of transparency, things look a little bit differently. But the
left
problem,
is Genesis, the right is Super Nintendo.
Oh, yeah, sorry. The problem with it is that they didn't spend much time on the resolution, and so it just sort of gets squished in. And so squished out. I don't remember. Squished out.
Squished in,
Yeah.
The Genesis had a wider resolution. Right?
Let me look better on the Super Nintendo. Right? I don't know.
Maybe I'm
But one of them is distorted just because.
The Super Nintendo is distorted because it was the one that was made.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which direction it's distorted in, I guess we
Yep.
don't remember.
There is some debate for that. You can probably tell better on the screen there. But one of them looks too fat, and one of them looks too thin. And that's the problem with the resolution.
And that was on Zombies Ate My Neighbors did the same.
Yeah.
They just chopped off.
Right, they chopped it off
Yeah,
and put the little like
Yeah, all their
squeeze
status bar got stuck on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
But Earthworm Jim, I don't know anybody that has not played it, but if you have not played it, do yourself a favor and play it. It's
The
fantastic.
Genesis or Sega CD version.
Yeah, Genesis preferable on one.
Okay, I'll get it on my agenda.
There's missing Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo. Were you guys?
This next one.
Okay, you're right.
Yeah, this is a
Cross-generation ports is a thing.
Yeah.
This was the only one that I could think.
Yeah, this is a thing that happened. A lot of people, until a couple of years ago, really didn't know that the Action 2 came out with Genesis. They are significantly different because they were done by two different people. Active, the guys who owned the Action 2 license and made the original NES card, did not make the Genesis version, which is better as a whole, but like a lot of the ones they ported over are actually worse, if you can believe how that works. They look nicer, but they play worse. The ones they made internally themselves and put on the cart, they tend to be actually okay. They're all just like clones with Afterburn with this type of thing. The only other significant piece of history that goes with that is the studio they had was some unknown studio named Farsight. That studio would 20 years later now become known for doing the pinball arcade game that is actually relatively popular among people and actually sells well. So you can make terrible garbage and eventually you could do something good with it. So, you know, never stop dreaming. But yeah, there wasn't a lot of that. There was a couple other ones you'd see like we saw with the NES stuff. A lot of the NES arcade ports would be developed for that system, and the Genesis would actually be like straight ports of the arcade versions with just some slight downgrading.
So in the 5th generation, we got PlayStation was like the big dog in the yard, right, during the 5th generation, and so then we got things ported to systems that were not the PlayStation. I'm just going to say right now, Resident Evil 2 on the N64, if you like Resident Evil, and you like Resident Evil 2, which in my opinion is the best or second best game in the series, the secret best version of Resident Evil 2 is the Nintendo 64 version.
That's not the game now.
With the expansion pack, actually a lot of the backgrounds are at a higher resolution than they were on the PlayStation. And all the FMVs somehow got in there. And the company that ported it to the N64 is actually the company that eventually became Rockstar San Diego. So figure that out. On the other side of things, the PlayStation versus the Saturn, Symphony of the Night was ported to the Saturn in Japan only. It added an extra playable character, and it's terrible. It's so bad. And that's one of my favorite games. And I don't know, they added an extra area that is awful.
Yeah,
and
the slowdown, like it just...
It's got really bad slowdown. And after talking about what they did with the Capcom arcade ports, it's so bizarre that they couldn't get Symphony of the Night to be awesome on the Saturn.
Go for
Konami.
Right.
Konami getting it.
God damn it, Konami.
Pull the lever! Okay, and beyond the 5th generation, not a lot going on here. Our big example is Ghostbusters. So at the top, you've got Ghostbusters for the PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360. You can tell the difference. And on the bottom, you've got it for the Wii or the PS2. That's the Wii version, actually, it's widescreen. And so, basically, they took this game and they went, okay, well, we'll just redo all the graphics. We can't do this realistic thing, so we'll do this cartoony style. But it's basically plays identically as far as I know.
There's not a huge amount of difference outside of that.
It's just the visual styles.
And they're both pretty relatively good games. Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, if you want to go.
Yeah, that version has 2-player co-op and like split screen on the Wii. That they don't have on them. So.
Because there was no online.
Yeah.
Licenses. This is our last section. So that's the big thing with how is that for one system one company would have the license, and for a different system a different company would have the license, and we don't really see that anymore. Especially like once EA paid to have exclusivity from the NFL, that's basically where that sort of dropped off. We still have that Sony has an MLB license for Sony consoles, which is why you get MLB The Show on Vita and PS3, PS4, and you still get MLB 2K.
RBI actually,
or whatever.
RBI came back because it was like a first party thing, so like they could make it, put it on third party. Like third parties could make it, but like Microsoft and Nintendo couldn't make their own.
Couldn't make their own baseball games.
It's not as strict.
So that's really the only trace of that you still have. But there was a time when one company would have the license for a Genesis game, and another company would, we're in the 3rd generation. One company had the license for the Master System, and it was always Sega because they only had themselves to rely upon. And somebody would have it for the other system. So what we see here is we've got Batman Returns on the NES, Batman Returns on the Master System. Konami had the license for Nintendo consoles, and Sega did the Sega versions, and they're totally different. Rambo, we've got there on the NES, and Rambo on the Sega Master System. Rambo on the Master System actually is only Rambo in the United States. In Europe, it's something different, and in Japan, it's something different. And they're different. Those are different from each other. So it's like it's whatever.
And that sort of thing is pretty interesting too. The international franchises and licenses, 'cause, like. Snoopy's Silly Sports on NES was Donald Duck.
In Japan.
Right, in Japan.
And then there was
Mickey Mouse was Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle was Mickey Mouse. Actually, the Crazy Castle series.
Roger Rabbit.
You're right. Sorry. No. It was Roger Rabbit on the Famicom Disk System, and it was Mickey Mouse on the Game Boy. Yeah, it's a mess. It's a big mess. Disney games.
Oh,
Man, let's talk about Disney games. So this is like this is our transition from the 3rd generation to the 4th generation. Because Capcom was doing them for Nintendo. Sunsoft did some for Sega. Sega did some of their own. Virgin did a bunch.
that was the one.
With Disney. So you get Disney games from all different developers. Yeah, from all different developers. That's why Aladdin in particular. We can all talk about Aladdin.
Yeah, I know we've all done it ad nauseum at this point.
Aladdin is so different because Virgin did the Genesis version and Capcom did the Super NES version. Darkwing Duck, we've got there. The Capcom did the NES version. Who did that garbage Turbo 16?
Somebody I never know about. That's what they deserve.
And so that sort of continues with through the 4th generation. I don't know, Dan, do you have any thoughts on Disney games for the? Okay. 5th generation, we get more of the same. So Tiny Toons games on the left there, those are both Konami. But Batman, the animated series, we had Konami doing the one Super NES version, and they did a Game Boy game as well, Batman the animated series. And then the Adventures of Batman and Robin on Genesis, Sega CD, and Game Gear were all done by Sega internally, or contracted. I don't know, you just recently did Tiny Toons, Dan. What are your thoughts on?
Yeah, it's odd because Konami did both of those games, but they're pretty different because the Super Nintendo has like some interesting gameplay mechanics. That has this thing where you can't jump on enemies; it'll hurt you. You have to do this weird kick flip thing. I hate it. I really don't like it. Genesis version much more straightforward, not really innovative, but I enjoy that a lot more just because it doesn't have you can jump on enemies.
Well, the Genesis one feels a lot more like the NES original, at least to me.
It's better.
And then later, I think Tiny Toons went to Sunsoft. Tiny Toons and Looney Tunes, I think, went to Sunsoft at some point in the 16-bit era. And we got more of those games. But it's just two different people's completely different interpretations of what that is. 5th generation, big noteworthy ones that we wanted to sort of draw attention to, we've got 3 minutes left to do it, are wrestling games. I'm not going to bore you, I love professional wrestling. I was a professional wrestler. I do, every year around WrestleMania time, I do a special video for WrestleMania. But suffice it to say that the N64 for WCW got these amazing, almost perfect wrestling games from THQ and Aki, and the PS1 got WCW Nitro and Thunder, and they are arguably the worst wrestling games ever made, and that is a pretty substantial title because a lot of wrestling games are not good. And same thing with James Bond, right? We got GoldenEye on the N64 from Rare and Nintendo, and we got, I think that's Tomorrow Never Dies for the PlayStation from EA. Man, not a good one. Eric, you did an episode on GoldenEye.
Yeah, specifically the remake. At the time I didn't have a PS3, and so it was the Wii version. Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in checking out the PS3 version now that I actually have one. But the GoldenEye remake was kind of interesting.
So not as good.
Modern FPS, I just haven't been able to get into it personally. And so there was a lot of fumbling around with trying to get used to it on my part. So I didn't enjoy it as much.
Right.
Definitely.
And I think that overall we can say about licensed games is that the quality, I feel, has gone up to a certain extent. Maybe not on handhelds as much, but certainly, the Batman Arkham series are great games. Stuff like that we've got now that we maybe didn't have as much of before. So we're just about out of time, so we're going to wrap up. And the big question is, what happened? And this is what happened. Okay, so this stuff isn't really interesting to talk about anymore unless it's something like somebody mentioned Batman Arkham City earlier on PC, which was so bug infested.
It still is. It still is.
It still doesn't work?
It still doesn't
They
work.
pulled it off Steam because it was so bad. So unless there's something where like it's just awful and it doesn't work, there's not really anything to talk about. Because if you look at these, I mean, if I took those labels away, you would probably be hard pressed to tell which of those is which. The only thing that I can really tell is that his patch is a little more pixelated on the 360 version.
One looks like a little lighter.
And that, the lighting is a little different on some of them, but like generally speaking, they all look good. They all play the same. The only real differences you get now are pre-order bonuses and stuff like that, or system exclusive skins, stuff
And like I
like
said, it
that.
has to do partially with EA and like that whole idea of client exclusivity. It has to do with the fact that it's become so expensive to develop for systems that you can't really take those kind of like differentiations. I mean, you kind of have to have parity among everything. You can't really develop without the idea of multi-platform in mind unless you're a first-party developer.
And you really have to because. All right, good deal. Okay, so we have to wrap up. The last word I'm going to say is just that all the systems are so similar. Previously, and Dan can attest to this, the Genesis and the Super Nintendo were so vastly different machines that you couldn't really make the same game. And that's just the way it is. So thank you so much for coming. I hope you learned something. We are going to go out in the big hallway, not right out here because it's small, but we'll be out in the big hallway for a few minutes if you guys want to ask questions. Hang out for a minute, chat, we will be out there, but we didn't have enough time to build questions into the presentation. So we're going to go out there, answer any questions.